Chapter 8. The whole of Germany was too much alive to what concerned us to be ignorant of the least reverse we might experience. These were reckoned by our enemies as so many more advantages on their side, and they accordingly raised fresh difficulties in the conferences in which the question of peace was under discussion. The emperor was impatient of the slowness of the negotiations, and being desirous of having the plenipotentiaries more within reach, he had transferred the seat of the conference to Vienna. Prince John of Liechtenstein was at this time the chief plenipotentiary on the part of Austria. In consequence of this alteration, the smallest details of what took place at the conferences were generally known in Vienna. So many persons were interested in the issue that no means were neglected that were calculated to elicit what was going forward. The emperor had some persons about him who obstinately believed that Austria was disposed to shake off the yoke of a government which had entailed such misfortunes upon the country. They never suffered any opportunity to escape of intruding upon the emperor their chimerical ideas, which they represented to him as the opinions of many enlightened citizens of Vienna, whilst they were nothing more than the idle dreams of some restless agitators who abandoned every capital. Intriguers appear to have acquired in almost every country the privilege of making dupes of honest men, and those of Vienna in particular would seem to have completely succeeded in imposing upon the distinguished officers of the emperor's army. The following anecdote was related to me by an eyewitness of the transaction. The first time the Marshal Bessières went out after recovering from the wound he had received at the Battle of Wagram, he paid the emperor a visit at his breakfast hour, which was immediately after the parade. The emperor had been but a few moments closeted with Marshal Bessières when a certain personage was announced, whom he ordered to be immediately introduced. Unaccustomed to see him at that hour, the emperor asked him in a jocose tone of voice, "What news? What are the reports now current in Vienna?" The reply given to these questions with the utmost candor was as follows: "Sire, the inhabitants of Vienna are penetrated with sincere admiration for your majesty. Each one sees in the soldier billeted upon him a protector near the person of a new sovereign whom your majesty may be pleased to grant to their wishes." As the emperor placed no reliance upon this assertion, he abstained from replying to it. He was just finishing his breakfast when I caused myself to be announced with the report which he expected from me. He was in high spirits, and asked me also what was the topic of conversation amongst the inhabitants of Vienna. I replied that they wished us to the devil from morning till night, and would assuredly make an attempt to get rid of us if we remained much longer amongst them. "This appears much nearer the truth," said the emperor in the presence of Marshal Bessières. "And we must not deceive ourselves. If peace be not concluded, we shall have Vendéan scenes to encounter in all directions. I pay no attention to idle talkers. It is high time for us to stop. I hope indeed that everything will be terminated in 2 or 3 days. The unsettled points are mere trifles." And peace was accordingly signed a very few days afterwards. I cannot venture to assert that the rumor of a change of dynasty had been spread for the purpose of intimidating the House of Austria and compelling it to adopt an early decision, but most assuredly the emperor never entertained such an idea, which was calculated to involve him in a war with Russia. Independently of the 2 wars he had already on his hands, and which called for all the resources of his genius, I am aware that the project was ascribed to him of forming a party in the nation, and of proclaiming the Grand Duke of Würzburg as Emperor of Austria, but I do not believe that he ever harbored such a design. His attention was too much engaged in the affairs of France and Spain to allow of his bestowing upon any an enterprise which would have necessarily detained him in Vienna. I recollect, moreover, that at this period he instructed me to send off from Paris to Bayonne a field equipage consisting of saddle horses, traveling carriages, etc., and to write at the same time to the Grand Equerry of the King of Spain, in order that the king should send some of his best horses to be in waiting at Burgos, to which city it was his intention to proceed as soon as possible. The treaty of peace, having been signed, was dispatched for the ratification of the Emperor of Austria, who was not slow in giving it his sanction. The Emperor issued a proclamation to the inhabitants of Vienna, wherein he thanked them for the attentions they had bestowed upon the wounded of his army. He also expressed how deeply he had lamented his inability to lighten the burdens that had pressed upon them, adding that to his consideration was to be attributed his having brought the war to a close, more than to any apprehension he could feel as to the issue of the contest. He concluded by saying that if during his long residence in the vicinity of the capital he had not oftener shown himself to them, the circumstance was wholly to be ascribed to his unwillingness to receive from them any of those testimonies of respect and homage to which, upon grounds of affection, their natural sovereign had an exclusive claim. This farewell address proved highly gratifying to the inhabitants of Vienna. The Emperor had shown them some indulgence, as the winter was approaching, and, too, the lower classes were poor in the extreme. He allowed them to cut wood in the imperial forest, and when the Austrian officers who had charge of the forest attempted to prevent this by causing representations to be made to the Emperor, he replied, "How would the Emperor your master act in such a case? He will be under the necessity not only of providing fuel for these poor people, but of also feeding them. Let them cut down the wood. I will be answerable for the act." The magistrates of Vienna came to take leave of him. They requested him to spare the ramparts of the city, which had been undermined upwards of a month for the purpose of being blown up. The Emperor refused to comply with their request and observed it was for their advantage that they should be destroyed, and it would prevent anyone from exposing the city to be burned to gratify private ambition. He assured them that this had been his intention in 1805, but that having, on the present occasion, been exposed to the painful alternative of either setting fire to Vienna or of running dangerous risks, he had not succeeded in compelling the enemy to open its gates. He would not subject himself to the like danger on any future occasion. The magistrates had to retire without accomplishing their object. And when the Emperor had taken his departure, the several undermining furnaces which had been built under the projecting angles of the walls surrounding the town were set on fire. The explosion was found to have affected 16 large openings. This operation occasioned great murmurings on the part of the inhabitants of Vienna. It was considered as an act of humiliation, although the Emperor had no intention to humble the population, but merely to throw the city open in such a manner as to render it incapable of sustaining a siege. We heard at some distance from Schönbrunn the report of the explosion of those furnaces. According to the stipulations of the Treaty of Peace, the capital, as well as the Austrian dominions, were to be evacuated within a certain time. Marshal Davout was the officer who was placed in command of the rear guard and was directed to deliver up the country to the Austrian authorities. He accordingly remained some time longer at Vienna. Mention has often been made of executions that had taken place, and the Emperor has been blamed for acts of severity to which he was a perfect stranger. He always gave his sanction to sentences already pronounced, but never directed anyone to be brought to judgment until regular proceedings had been previously instituted, and a report had been presented to him accompanied by a proposal that the party should either be put upon trial or set at liberty. And he never failed to approve whatever proposal was submitted to him. A circumstance occurred previously to his departure from Vienna, which greatly indisposed him against the minister of police. As the Emperor was returning one day from a ride, he found in the courtyard of the palace a lady of a respectable appearance, accompanied by 2 little children, all 3 in deep mourning. The Emperor at first imagined that she was the widow of some officer killed in battle. He came up to them with an expression indicative of the interest he took in their fate, but his countenance suddenly altered when he learned that she had brought those children from Caen in Normandy to solicit the Emperor's pardon for their mother, who had been condemned to death by the criminal tribunal of that town. The emperor did not at first recollect any circumstance of this affair. He saw, however, that it could not be of a most serious complexion in consequence of the long journey performed for the purpose of soliciting his pardon for a condemned person. This lady was not provided with any letter of recommendation. She wholly calculated upon and appealed to the feelings of the emperor, who asked her name of the person on whose behalf she came to intercede. She then named Madame de D. This brought the matter to the emperor's recollection, and he replied to her that he regretted he could do nothing to indemnify her for the fatigues of so painful a journey as she had undertaken, as it was out of his power to give her an answer until he had ascertained the opinion of the council, especially in a case like the present one, which brought to his mind certain circumstances of so serious a nature that he doubted much whether he could avail himself of the privilege of showing mercy on the occasion. I saw the moment when he was on the point of granting pardon. His heart had already pronounced it, but other considerations interfered to stifle his feelings of sensibility. He was much incensed at the minister of police, who, after making a great stir in this affair and claiming merit to himself for his conduct in it, could afterwards consent to grant passports in order to put it in the power of anyone to solicit his staying the execution of a judgment respecting which he had not yet made any communication to him. If it be a case deserving of pardon, he said, with great truth, why did he not write to me on this subject? If otherwise, why grant passports to a family I am obliged to send away in the deepest affliction? He complained much of this mismanagement on the part of the minister of police. The person in whose behalf the emperor's pardon was solicited was a Madame D., who was divorced from her husband and led a very loose life. After her divorce, she had retired to her mother's house with her 2 children, and their residence was close to the road, at a distance of 7 or 8 leagues from the town of Caen. The public conveyances had been frequently stopped and robbed in that neighborhood, without any clue being afforded of the authors of the depredations, which were carried on by men who called themselves chouans or royalists in order to conceal their shameful trade, but who in reality plundered on their own account. Every endeavor was made to discover traces of those robbers, when the circumstances which it would be too long to relate brought some of them to light. The others were shortly afterwards found out. They were all what might be called gentlemen and allied to respectable families, but had lost themselves by falling into bad company. Madame D. had so far connected herself with the party as to afford them an asylum in her house, where they met previously to the commission of the robbery, and where they afterwards returned to divide the spoils. She had been reduced to this degraded condition by her dissolute mode of living, was brought before the tribunal in consequence of the evidence of her accomplices, convicted of the crime and condemned. Her counsel had no doubt advised her to declare herself pregnant, in order that the execution of the sentence might be stayed, and to have time to send her mother and children to sue for pardon on her behalf. If there was a possibility of granting it to her without infringing upon what was due to society, it became the duty of the minister of police to make a communication to the emperor to that effect. If otherwise, the minister ought not to have allowed a family to undertake the journey when they had to return back with broken hearts, and with every appearance of being the victims of the emperor's cruelty. An adventure of another description occurred before his departure from Vienna, which might have been attended with unpleasant consequences had not the emperor's service been so effectually attended to that the mischief was repaired without being made public. He had just signed the treaty of peace and dictated 2 letters to his confidential secretary, M. de Meneval, the one for the Emperor of Austria, the other for the Emperor of Russia. He did not wait until they had been fair copied, but proceeded to inspect the troops filing off on the parade. When Mr. de Meneval had finished the letters, he laid them on the Emperor's desk in order that he might read and sign them on his return, it being the Emperor's practice to read over whatever he had dictated. He likewise prepared 2 envelopes on the backs of which he wrote the addresses beforehand, in order that the letters might the sooner be dispatched after the return of the emperor, which was shortly afterwards. He read and signed both letters, and whilst Monsieur de Meneval was added to one of them what he had further dictated to him, he folded the other up, placed it in the envelope, sealed it, carried the letter in person to the Austrian general, Bubna, who had gone to wait after the parade in the adjoining apartment. The general was already on his way to the headquarters of the Emperor of Austria when Meneval, wishing to fold up the second letter in its envelope, discovered that the envelope for the Emperor of Russia had remained behind, though he held in his hand the letter intended for the Emperor of Austria. So the General Bubna had carried away the letter intended for the Emperor of Russia, enclosed in an envelope addressed to the Emperor of Austria. It is, I think, quite superfluous to state that this was not by any means an immaterial circumstance. The Emperor, therefore, hurried off to dispatch some person in all haste after General Bubna, who had just passed the iron grating of the palace when he was overtaken. He was told that the Emperor wished him to return because he had something to add to the letter of which he was the bearer. Each letter was then laid in its proper envelope, and the mistake never transpired. Ever since this occurrence, the Emperor refrained from expediting any more dispatches. He left the task to Monsieur de Meneval, who was constantly near his person. Chapter 8. Austria lost by the Treaty of Peace a population of about 3 millions of inhabitants, having ceded Galicia with the Illyrian provinces some territories on the Innviertel, as well as the province of Salzburg. Some augmentation of territory was allowed to the Confederated Princes of Germany. The population of Bavaria, in particular, was nearly doubled since 1805. In each war, the emperor had replaced the sovereign of that country upon his throne, and his army had acquired a national glory by fighting in conjunction with ours. The emperor was partial to the Bavarians. General Vrede was one of those whom he distinguished from the rest previously to quitting Germany. He gave him an estate producing an annual revenue of 36,000 livres on the frontiers of Bavaria and in that portion of territory which it obtained from Austria by the Treaty of Peace. Austria must have been exceedingly apprehensive of the consequences of resumption of hostilities when it could submit to such heavy sacrifices, unless it had some latent object in view, and it gave its consent because some of them were incompatible with its political existence. Could I have ventured to express an opinion on the subject, I should have greatly mistrusted such extraordinary proof of resignation. I cannot say whether the emperor relied much upon its sincerity. This, however, is certain, that on quitting Vienna he went to Passau on the Inn, where he had ordered immense fortifications to be raised, and on visiting them, he not only did not desire the work to be slackened, but he urged the necessity of placing the town in the best possible state of defense. He waited 2 days at Passau in expectation of a courier whom M. de Champigny was to send to him from Vienna, and he did not take his final departure for France until the courier had arrived. From Passau we proceeded to Landshut, and from Freising to Munich, where the emperor was greeted as its deliverer. The court was residing at the palace of Nymphenburg, where the emperor alighted. He remained 2 or 3 days with the king of Bavaria, and afterwards sent to Augsburg to visit the old elector of Treves, who since the Congress of Ratisbon bore the title of Bishop of Augsburg. He dined with him and immediately afterwards set off for Stuttgart, stopping on his way at Ulm, where he supped with Monsieur de Grauvenrenth, the civil governor of the circle, who had been the king of Bavaria's minister at his court during the campaign of 1805. He continued his journey the same night and arrived early the next morning at the residence of the king of Württemberg, who had returned with his court to Stuttgart, and who gave him a splendid reception. He remained a day with this sovereign and continued his journey to Karlsruhe, at which place he stayed but a short time and arrived at Strasbourg, where he only stopped the time requisite for receiving reports of all the constructions he had ordered to be made in that town and at the fortress of Kiel. He then proceeded without stopping as far as Fontainebleau, where he had given directions for his household to meet him and for the ministers to bring him the statement of proceedings in their respective departments. He traveled, however, at such a rapid rate that he was the first to arrive. Not a servant was yet in attendance. Whilst waiting for his suite, he visited the new apartments he had ordered to be built. This was the first time that any use was made of the building situated in the courtyard of the White House, where the military school had formerly stood, which had just been transferred to Saint-Cyr. He had had the apartments laid out as a drawing room for the purpose of affording employment to the manufacturers of Lyon and the workmen of Paris. Immense crowds of people came from all quarters to see him. No expressions were found inadequate to convey their love and affection for him. If a monarch is justified in relying upon the homage of the people over whom he rules, is there anyone who has received more testimonies of it than were displayed towards the emperor by all Frenchmen and by the people of many other countries? The empress, who was at St. Cloud, came immediately to Fontainebleau, and in a few hours after her arrival, society was formed of the most elegant ladies of the court, which was a model of elegance. There were very few that could not claim a husband, a brother, or a son, either in the emperor's suite or in his army, and I do not think he omitted in any one case to inquire after their healths and to give them tidings about their relatives. On those occasions he appeared much less in the character of a monarch coming to receive expressions of homage and submission than in that of a kind and benevolent father, delighting to see about him persons so closely allied to those whom he had made participators in his career of glory. The palace of Fontainebleau had been raised by his care from the heap of ruins which it formerly presented to the eye, and he had restored it, as if by a magician's wand, to a state of splendor which it had never before displayed, not even in the gayest days of Louis XIV. We reached Fontainebleau on the 29th of October, 1809, and the emperor remained there until the 21st of November following. During that interval of time, he appointed a successor to the Minister of the Interior, who had died during the campaign. He selected, amongst several candidates, M. de Montalivet, the then Director General of Public Roads, to whose family he was much attached. He never spoke of its qualities without making use of the following expressions: "They are a family of the strictest probity. They are all heart, and I place great dependence in their affections for me." He only did them justice. They were incapable of being ungrateful, for M. de Montalivet was a man of honor in the fullest acceptation of that term. The emperor quitted Fontainebleau to return to Paris, and also to see the King of Saxony, who had just arrived for the express purpose of paying him a visit and of thanking him for having delivered his kingdom and extended its limits. The emperor signed for his residence the palace of the Élysée, which had been fitted up in a style adapted for a royal personage, and all the high authorities of the state hastened to pay their respects to that virtuous monarch. His example was followed by the other princes of the Confederation, and we witnessed the arrival, first of the King of Württemberg, to whom the emperor signed the palace of the Luxembourg, the next to the King of Bavaria, who came a little later, as well as the Prince Primate and the other princes from the borders of the Rhine. This winter was remarkable for the gaiety of its fetes and amusements, as well as by the greatest event that had yet attracted our attention. 1,000 idle stories have been related concerning the emperor's motives for breaking the bonds which he had contracted upwards of 15 years before, and for separating from a person who was the partner of his existence during the most stormy events of his glorious career. It was ascribed to his ambition to connect himself with the royal blood, and malevolence has delighted in spreading the report that to this consideration he had sacrificed every other. This opinion was quite erroneous, and he was as unfairly dealt with on the subject as all persons are who happen to be placed above the level of mankind. Nothing can be more true than that the sacrifice of the object of his affections was the most painful he ever experienced throughout his life, and that he would have preferred adopting any other course than the one to which he was driven by motives which I am about to relate. Public opinion was in general unjust towards the emperor when he placed the imperial crown upon his head. A feeling of personal ambition was supposed to be the mainspring of all of his actions. This was, however, a very mistaken impression. I've already mentioned with what reluctance he had altered the form of government, and that if he had not been apprehensive that the state would again fall a prey to those dissensions which are inseparable from an elective form of government, he would not have changed an order of things which appeared to be the first solid conquest achieved by the revolution. Ever since he had brought the nation back to monarchical principles, he had neglected no means of consolidating institutions which permanently secured those principles, and yet firmly established the superiority of modern ideas over antiquated customs. Differences of opinion could no longer create any disturbance respecting the form of government when his career should be closed. But this was not enough. It was further requisite that the line of inheritance should be defined in so clear a manner that at his death no pretense might be made for the falling out of any pretenders to the throne, because if such a misfortune were to take place, the least foreign intervention would have sufficed to revive a spirit of discord among us. His feeling of personal ambition consisted in this case in a desire to hand his work down to posterity, and to resign to his successor a state resting upon his numerous trophies for its stability. He could not be blind to the fact that the perpetual warfare into which a jealousy of his strength had plunged him had in reality no other object than his own downfall, because with him must necessarily crumble that gigantic power which was no longer upheld by the revolutionary energy he had himself repressed. And in order then to strike an overwhelming terror abroad, that volcanic fever should be fed, within which often proves the safety of empires, but when treated by a skillful hand, will occasionally be used as a means of enslaving them. He had always extricated himself with glory from every enterprise directed against him. They had mostly been productive of an effect, the reverse of which his enemies had contemplated, and they had thus been instrumental in affording him those overwhelming resources which appeared to them the more formidable when wielded by so mighty a genius. But since they so often attempted to wrest those resources from his grasp, when he was present at the head of his armies, what attempts were we not to apprehend from them under his successor, who in the first place could only be such in a collateral line, and who would, in the second place, have found the nation exhausted, the army quite disheartened, and the moving springs of public opinion worn out. These were the considerations which fixed his determination and made him occasionally exclaim, when speaking of his enemies, "They have all sworn my ruin, but have not the courage to compass it." These were, I repeat it, the considerations which made him reflect on the choice of a successor. The emperor had not any children. The empress had two, whose destinies appeared immovably fixed, and he never could have entertained a thought of them without exposing himself to most serious inconveniences and doing something so imperfect that it would carry its principles of destruction along with it. I believe, however, that if the two children of the empress had been the only ones in his family, he would have made some arrangement for securing his inheritance to the viceroy, because such an event might have been brought about without any national convulsion or disturbance, and no part of the order he had established would thereby have been deranged. The viceroy was a prince well qualified for business, of a lofty mind, and deeply impressed with the extent of his duties towards the emperor, and he would have imposed upon himself the obligation of consolidating the whole system of government such as it would have been handed over to him. My opinion is grounded upon the knowledge I had that the emperor was always pleased at his submission to his will, and sometimes said that the viceroy had never yet given him the smallest cause of displeasure. He, however, dismissed the idea of appointing him his heir because he had near relations, and it would have given rise to disunions, which it was his principal object to avoid. He also considered the necessity in which he was placed of forming an alliance sufficiently powerful in order that in the event of his system being at any time threatened, that alliance might be a resisting point and save it from total ruin. He likewise hoped that it would be the means of putting an end to that series of wars, of which he was above all things desirous to avoid a recurrence. Those were the motives which determined him to break a union so long contracted. He wished it less for himself than for the purpose of interesting a powerful state in the maintenance of the order of things established in France. He reflected oftentimes on the mode of making this communication to the Empress. Still, he was reluctant to speak to her. He was apprehensive of the consequences of her tenderness of feelings. His heart was never proof against the shedding of tears. He thought, however, that a favorable opportunity offered for breaking the subject previously to his quitting Fontainebleau. He hinted at it in a few words which he had addressed to the Empress, but did not explain himself until the arrival of the Viceroy, whom he had ordered to join him. He was the first person who spoke openly to his mother and obtained her consent for that bitter sacrifice. He acted on the occasion like a kind son and a man grateful to his benefactor and devoted to his service by sparing him the necessity of unpleasant explanations towards a partner whose removal was a sacrifice as painful to him as it was affecting. The emperor, having arranged whatever related to the future condition of the empress, upon whom he made a liberal settlement, urged the moment of the dissolution of the marriage, no doubt because he felt grieved at the condition of the Empress herself, who dined every day and passed her evenings in the presence of persons who were witnessing her descent from the throne. There existed between him and the Empress Josephine no other bond than a civil act according to the custom which prevailed at the time of his marriage. Now the laws had foreseen the dissolution of such marriage contracts. A particular day having therefore been fixed upon, the emperor brought together in his apartments those persons whose ministry was required in this case, amongst others, the Arch-Chancellor and Monsieur Rignon de Saint-Jean d'Angely. The emperor then declared in a loud voice his intention of annulling the marriage he had contracted with Josephine, who was present. The empress also made the same declaration, which was interrupted by her repeated sobs. The Prince Arch-Chancellor, having caused the article of the law to be read, he applied it to the case before him and declared the marriage to be dissolved. Chapter 19. The formalities of the divorce having been gone through, the Empress took leave of the Emperor and retired to her apartment, which was on the ground floor. In consequence of arrangements agreed upon beforehand, she took a departure the next morning for Malmaison, where she fixed her residence. The Emperor likewise departed the same day for Trianon, feeling an aversion to remain alone in that immense palace of the Tuileries, which constantly brought the Empress Josephine to his mind. She descended from the highest rank in the state with great resignation, saying that she was amply repaid for the loss of honors by the consolation of having obeyed the emperor's will. In quitting the court, she drew the hearts of all its votaries after her. She was endeared to all by a kindness of disposition which was without parallel. Her condescension to everyone was as great when she became empress as previously to her elevation. She was profuse of her bounties and bestowed them with such good grace that the partakers of them would have deemed it an act of incivility to refuse her. No applicant ever left her presence with empty hands. She never did the smallest injury to anyone. In the days of her power, her very enemies found in her protectress not a day of her life, but what she asked of favor for some person, oftentimes wholly unknown to her, but whom she found to be deserving of her protection. She placed many families in a state of comparative independence and was surrounded of late years by a swarm of children whose mothers had been married and settled in life through her bounties. Malevolence made it a reproach to her that her expenses bordered on prodigality. Ought this be laid to her charge. The same scrutinizing spirit did not descend to inquire into what she laid out in the education of children belonging to indigent parents. No notice has been taken of what she distributed in charities amongst private families, regardless of self. Her whole time was engaged in attending to the wants of others. Everyone regretted her for the sake of the emperor's own sake, for it was well known that she never spoke to him otherwise than in favorable terms. Of all those who were about his person, she was even of service to Mr. Fouché, who had in some measure attempted to become the instrument for bringing about her divorce 12 months sooner than it took place. During her stay at Malmaison, the high road from Paris to that residence presented, even in bad weather, the appearance of a procession. Each one deemed it his bounden duty to present himself there at least once a week. The emperor, on his part, did all he could to habituate himself to a solitary life at Trianon, where he had fixed his own residence. He frequently sent to Malmaison to inquire after the health of the empress. And I really think that had it not been for the accumulation of business, he would have gone there in person. On the occasion of this event, he had summoned to Paris several members of his family who came to keep him company at Trianon. The King of Bavaria also arrived in Paris with his queen about the same time. He remained there after the departure of the other sovereigns of Germany. The winter was passed in the gay enjoyments of masked balls and other similar amusements. The emperor was particularly desirous that every means of diversion should be afforded to the princes who had come to visit him. He was particularly attentive to the Queen of Bavaria, to whose service he had attached some of the maids of honor belonging to the palace of the Empress. Towards the end of January, all the princes had returned home, and there were only a few members of the Emperor's family in Paris. In the midst of all those diversions, the Emperor was not unmindful of public affairs. The English had been compelled to evacuate Flushing and the island of Walcheren, where nearly the whole of their army was laid up in hospitals owing to the prevailing sickness. In consequence of the occupation of Flushing by the English, the Emperor complained to the King of Holland that his troops had not done their duty. There was a small fort in the Scheldt called the Fort of Bast, which surrendered to the English fleet without firing a shot. He alleged that the harbor and arsenal of Antwerp were not sufficiently protected, whilst it had such neighbors as the Dutch in its vicinity. And with this impression upon his mind, he was desirous of making arrangements in order to obtain from him the surrender of a part of the military frontiers of Holland in that direction. He had to complain of the resistance offered by his brother, who had come to Paris on the occasion of the divorce. That resistance assumed a serious character. I know not who it was who put it into the head of the King of Holland that whilst he was in Paris, the Emperor had given orders for the troops that had returned to Antwerp since the peace to establish themselves in the Bergen-op-Zoom, Bois-le-Duc, and Breda, being the fortresses along the new frontier which it was wished to occupy in order to be the masters of the eastern Scheldt and of the remaining part of the Maese. There is no doubt, however, that some traitor reported to the King of Holland the projects which he had perhaps supposed the Emperor to entertain. For the Emperor, who had always private sources of information on every subject, was surprised that the king intended to send a courier to Holland with instructions for the 3 fortresses to resist any attempt of the French troops to take possession of them. It was further added that his instructions went so far as that if an order should be presented bearing his own signature for the surrender of the fortresses to the French, it was not to be complied with until he should have returned to his dominions, wishing thereby to create the impression that he was not perhaps in the full enjoyment of liberty, or that his signature might have been surreptitiously obtained. The Emperor, who naturally felt displeased that this design should be attributed to him, was more particularly so when he reflected upon the mischief which such a letter was calculated to produce in Holland, especially as he could have had no motive for writing it. He was at the Théâtre Français in the afternoon of the day on which these details were made known to him. I had the honor to accompany him on that occasion, and it appears that his mind was much taken up with what had been reported to him, for he desired me to approach and whispered to me the order to go directly to the Minister of Police and desire him to cause every courier going from Paris to Holland to be stopped at the barriers. I found the minister at home. He issued his orders in my presence and called for his carriage, saying that he would proceed forthwith to the King of Holland. He must necessarily have been apprehensive of some event consequent upon what had been reported to the emperor, or upon the attention of the King of Holland. For being ignorant of what had occurred, I had not said anything to him. I returned to inform the emperor of my having executed his orders. He was still at the theatre, and appeared rather astonished that the Minister of Police should have proceeded so quickly to visit the King of Holland. For my part, I accounted for it in this manner. The Minister of Police wished to interfere more or less in every business, and kept upon terms with every party. It therefore occurred to me that he had himself inspired some uneasiness into the mind of the king, who may thereupon have uttered some hasty expressions which the minister went to repeat to the emperor, but that, as he now received an order to stop the king's couriers, he had hurried away to apprise him of such an order that he might be on his guard with respect to any dispatches of consequence, leaving at the same time all unimportant ones with the couriers, so that the seizure of some papers might serve as a proof that the order had been carried into effect. Whether he arrived at the king's residence before or after the departure of the courier, who went off the same night and was stopped at the barrier, is a point I am unable to determine, but I afterwards had strong grounds to suspect that the courier, having been brought to the Minister of Police, the latter only delivered up to the emperor such dispatches as the King of Holland was indifferent about. If therefore the courier had already gone off with the minister, when he saw the king, he would have returned the dispatches found of which he was the bearer, and enabled the King of Holland to suppress such of them as he thought proper. And if the courier only left after the minister's visit, it was still more easy for him to deceive. It is quite certain that the king intended to make an open resistance, and that his orders were expected in Holland. The courier must evidently have been the bearer of those orders. The emperor was perfectly well aware of the opposition of the king, his brother, in that respect, and was not surprised that he should accordingly write to Holland, in which country he knew that preparations of defense were going on. He was infinitely more surprised, therefore, to find that no mention was made of the subject in the dispatches brought to him. I concluded from all this that the Minister of Police, being apprehensive of the consequences for himself of the explanation that might be expected to take place between the emperor and the king, if the tone and tenor of the dispatches had called for it, had conceived the idea of deceiving them both, because the king would have unquestionably justified himself by saying that his fears proceeded from the minister. And it is equally clear that the emperor would have told his brother that this very minister had been the informer against him. The emperor said nothing, but his suspicions were now awakened, and he laid up this anecdote in store with others which he intended to bring forward at the proper time. The King of Holland had a fine opportunity of complaining of the violence done to him. There was nothing to show that he was in the wrong. When, however, he found the emperor so much bent on carrying a point which he had previously been the subject of an official correspondence through the Minister for Foreign Affairs, he gave way, and Marshal Oudinot, who was stationed on the frontier, received orders to enter Holland and take possession of the ceded territory. After the peace, the emperor had sent a great part of his forces back to Spain, and the remainder of the army had been quartered in the German provinces, which previous treaties had placed at his disposal. A violent outcry was raised against this measure, which was alleged as a proof that the emperor sought to stir up a fresh war. A spirit of calumny and malevolence prevented those who entertained it from considering that the troops quartered in foreign countries paid out of their revenues, afforded to that extent a relief to the public treasury, which would otherwise have been under the necessity of sending enormous sums of money for the pay and maintenance of the troops. The same individuals who entertained such sentiments retorted that the plainest course to be adopted was to make peace. But it was for this very purpose that we retained foreign provinces in our possession and kept up so large an army. The emperor was under the necessity of making it bear its due proportion to the aggregate amount of the forces which his enemies might oppose to him. He kept the German provinces with the intention of giving them up in exchange for what he had to ask of England on his own behalf and on that of his allies. He was bereft of the power of reconquering the French and Dutch possession beyond seas, of which both nations equally stood in need. But he held in his power some German provinces and states in alliance with England, which were hereafter to be restored either to their independence or to their former owners. He must either resort to those means for concluding a peace with England, or the war would have no end. England was augmenting her power in the four quarters of the globe. The power of the emperor was increased in Europe only, and he kept in his possession what interested England alone, in order to have in hand wherewith to settle his accounts with her. It is supposed, for instance, that the emperor could ever dream of retaining Danzig, Lübeck, Hamburg, Hanover, Holland, Erfurt, Fulda, etc., etc. He would have restored everything for the object of reestablishing the balance of power in the possessions beyond seas between the different maritime nations. He would have gone further and have eventually separated Italy from France if Spain could have effected her revolution without commotion and without a struggle. He only kept Italy with the view of saving it from its ancient habits and of drawing from it at the same time the means of more effectually resisting that series of coalitions against him, which were no sooner broken down than they were formed again. Had it not been for Italy, he could not have resisted the first well-directed attack, but it supplied him with men, money, and stores, and interposed a large space as well as serious obstacles between him and his enemies. Had he consented to look upon Italy with indifference, he must have sunk at once beneath the rank of a second-rate power. Italy could not maintain an attitude of neutrality. When the force of old habits should have resumed its influence, it would have proved ungrateful to us and given to our enemies the benefit of all the resources we derived from it. And if the emperor had not had Naples or Spain at his command, France must have been in a much weaker state than before the revolution, especially when again, in the course of time, those two countries should have been governed by princes equally prudent and warlike, who would have endeavored to strengthen their power by giving it greater extension. The sovereigns who waged war against him under pretense that his overgrown power was calculated to disturb the repose of the world would not allow that we had anything to apprehend from theirs, which had extended beyond all bounds, both previously to and during the Revolution. Chapter 20. We had now reached the end of January 1810. The emperor's divorce had been pronounced in the preceding month, and he had in all appearance already bent his thoughts upon forming a fresh union with a princess who would be the means of drawing closer the ties of an alliance productive of advantage to France, and might present him with an heir whom all parties were agreed in considering as the only obstacle to the return of internal discord. There was not at this period any princess of a marriageable age among the reigning families of the great powers of Europe, except in Russia, and Her Imperial Highness the Archduchess Maria Louisa of Austria, and one of her sisters, each of whom was older than the Russian princess. The emperor was only 40 years old at the time, and although there was a considerable disproportion in point of age, many motives have induced him to sacrifice private appearance to reasons of state policy. He felt a personal regard for the Emperor of Russia, with whom he was in alliance, and notwithstanding the resentment he entertained at the conduct of his army in the campaign which he had just brought to a close, he would have gladly availed himself of another opportunity of drawing closer to the bond of an alliance with Russia, which had been eagerly entered into by both parties, and which, if properly kept up and rigidly adhered to, would effectually prevent the peace of Europe from being ever more disturbed. There existed, moreover, no circumstances calculated to prevent a most perfect intimacy between those two great powers. Their armies, whenever they met, had learned to set a high value upon each other, whereas, after all that had taken place between Austria and us, we could not bring ourselves to fix our attention for a moment towards that power. It is supposed that the emperor wrote confidentially to Monsieur de Caulaincourt, his ambassador in Russia, about the end of December or beginning of January, relative to the design he had formed in uniting himself to the Princess Anna Pavlovna. For I recollect that on the occasion of a court circle at the Palace of the Tuileries after his return from the Trianon, he asked me in a low tone of voice to point out to him which of the ladies in the apartment I thought most like in point of figure to the Grand Duchess Anne of Russia. I happened to be the only Frenchman in company who had had the honor of seeing her, but she was then only 16 years of age, and though she promised well, I still had some difficulty in satisfying his curiosity. He again repeated the subject, and I think that if the reply to the letter he had caused to be delivered by Monsieur de Caulaincourt had been such as he desired, he would not have hesitated a moment in following up his design. He was in great impatience to receive it when, instead of the one he expected, he received a letter from the Emperor of Russia, who neither accepted nor rejected the proposal. 6 weeks would necessarily elapse before a reply could be received to any message from Paris to St. Petersburg, because a fortnight was allowed for the official communication to be made, and a fortnight for each courier. The 6 first weeks had therefore been wholly thrown away, but the public mind was at work in the interval. Wagers were made for and against the marriage, because in such a city as Paris everything is repeated, and so many various conjectures are formed upon matters wholly unknown, that by dint of guessing the truth will sometimes come out. The approaching marriage of the emperor with a Russian princess was sufficiently the topic of conversation for all opinions to have become settled upon the subject, and every one was already on the alert to obtain some station at the court of the new sovereign, when a circumstance originating in an intrigue took place which disturbed every calculation. After the last treaty of peace, Austria had sent to Paris an ambassador, the Prince of Schwarzenberg, who lately commanded the army in the field. He was in a truly painful position, and nothing short of the utmost zeal for the service of his sovereign could have induced him to hold that station in Paris. After the disastrous events which Austria had experienced, he had, however, the constancy to remain there. His parties were numerously attended. The residence of an ambassador is never wanting in parasites when a good dinner and a friendly reception are given. Certain habits had already been adopted at the hotel of Prince Schwarzenberg, who had with him as chief secretary of embassy the Chevalier de Fleuret, a person well known in Paris. This, no doubt, was the reason of his having been selected. Monsieur de S., a senator, had formerly been ambassador from France in Holland, where he had known Monsieur de Fleuret, who was employed in the Austrian legation of that country. S., being on a certain evening at the hotel of the Austrian ambassador, Prince Schwarzenberg, met Fleuret there, and in a tete-a-tete conversation which diplomatists always delight in, S. spoke to him of the current events and of the rumors of the emperor's approaching marriage with a Russian princess, but that it was as yet a mere project. Nothing had been determined upon. He expressed at the same time his astonishment to the Chevalier de Fleuret that the court of Austria, which was graced by several handsome princesses, should not take any step to procure them a preference, adding that this was an awkward omission, as such a course was the only one calculated to retrieve her affairs. That it was, besides, well known in Austria that if this opportunity was missed, matters might go on much worse on a future occasion. Whether the Chevalier de Fleuret suspected that this communication partook in some respects of an official character, or whether he considered it as mere idle conversation, he answered Monsieur de S. as a man delighted at his observations and with the view of coming at the truth of what he had said. He replied that they would no doubt be much flattered in Vienna to receive a proposal of such a nature, but that the rules of etiquette forbade the mention of princesses, whose names ought to be held in the highest respect, that it would first be necessary to know how the subject would be received at the Tuileries. The conversation proceeded no farther. Monsieur de S. went immediately to the Secretary of State, the Duc de Bassano, and found him on the eve of going to the Emperor for the purposes of transacting business with him. He related to conversation he had just had with the Chevalier de Fleuret, with this difference, however, that he stated it as if Monsieur de Fleuret had been the first to break the ice, and had said, We do not name our princesses because we do not know how the proposal would be received, and however anxious we may be, it behooves us to wait until we shall have attracted attention. This version was widely removed from the truth. It might be inferred from it that Austria desired the marriage, and had even given secret instructions to her ambassador, either to watch an opportunity of mentioning this subject or to give a reply if the occasion should call for it. In the first conversation, Monsieur de S had given a kind of private information to Monsieur de Fleuret, whereas it was made to appear by what he related to Monsieur de Bassano, that Monsieur de Fleuret had himself given him to understand that Austria was desirous of that alliance, for which she was apprehensive of making the first advances, lest the offer should be rejected. The Duc de Bassano did not fail to report everything to the Emperor. He was in favor of the measure, and the Emperor the more readily listened to it, as there appeared to him great mystery in the conduct of Russia with respect to the question which he had caused to be agitated at that court. As he saw no grounds for expecting a favorable issue to it, he instructed M. de Bassano, happen what might, to pay a semi-official visit to the Prince of Schwarzenberg, as if his only object were to ascertain what might be the real intentions of the cabinet of Vienna regarding such a proposal. In case of its being ventured upon, the ambassador could only give the most favorable assurances. But in order to make more sure of the matter, he requested time to send off a courier with dispatches, the reply to which he would not fail to make the Duc de Bassano acquainted with. He did so accordingly. This was so promising an event for the self-love of many individuals that nothing was neglected that was calculated to ensure success. The senator, therefore, who was on terms of intimacy with M. de Bassano, hastened to tell M. de Fleuret how matters stood with the court of Russia, in order that he might appear at court as a man well informed of everything, and that they might both derive all the credit which they would no doubt claim at second hand for having accelerated a negotiation so interesting to the welfare of both countries.